And there are, we're just talking about the historical ways, chapter 1 through 6, and then the prophetic chapters, chapters 7 through 12. This is the most, generally the most accepted way of dividing the book. I lend myself to thinking this way, particularly because if you study chapters 1 through 6 first and see and learn the lessons from these chapters, it will set yourself up to understand the prophetic portion of the book 7 through 12. If you don't have the background of chapters 1 through 6, you're not going to be able to understand the prophetic portions. So that is why I lend myself to looking at it that way. Brother Rex Turner looks at it in the chronological order, and we'll talk more about that at a later date as we get to it. Chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then chapters 7, 8, 5, and 6 in that order, because they're chronologically in that order. And then he goes chapters 11, 10, 12, and for some reason he believes chapter 9 is the last to be written. But we'll talk about that more at a later date. Now, as we get into the background information, the first, one of the more important things that we need to discuss is why is Israel, why is Judah in such a condition? And without spending just a little bit of time at looking at the kings, it's kind of difficult to understand exactly how they've gotten themselves in such a position that in the third year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes and besieges Jerusalem. Why is it that God has not protected them? Well, they pretty much have done this to themselves. And so we're going to look for a moment at the kings and see what has happened throughout history very quickly. And I encourage you to take a look at the kings and prophets of Israel, that handout of Israel and Judah, and we'll just look at that real quickly. And you can study this more in depth on your own time, because we're just going to breeze over this. We know, as we've been studying here, at least in this congregation, how that Saul was the first king, David was the second king, Ishbosheth for a period of time had the 10 tribes for just a couple of years, but then after that David united all of the tribes of Israel under his reign, and then they remained united under Solomon as well. So what we call normally the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and then Solomon. Then after that, we see the period of the divided kingdom. If you look to the right, you'll see under that period of time there are prophets. Samuel being the first prophet, and then Gad being the seer of David. He's called a seer, he's also called a prophet. And then Nathan the prophet. Gad was especially David's prophet. I would think that from the way he was spoken of, he most likely lived in Jerusalem and stayed close to David most of the time, and so he got to speak. David got to speak to Gad most whenever he had a question that he wanted to ask of Jehovah God. But Nathan was an individual that did not stay necessarily around, but only came from time to time and gave David a message as he was told to give David a message. And he continued for a short period of time into Solomon's reign. Now, as we look into the rest of the kings, from that period of time, you'll see a statement at the beginning or at the end of each king's reign that he was either a good king, he did that was good in the Lord's eyes, or he did that was bad in the Lord's eyes. You won't find a good king in all of Israel's reign. They were all evil kings. But in the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, you'll find that there were several good kings. Now, when you look at whether they were good or bad, I suggest to you that we're not talking about whether or not they were saved. We're not talking about whether or not this individual was a wonderful individual or not. We're talking about the overall thrust of this person's leadership over the kingdom. What kind of a legacy did this king leave? Did he leave a good legacy, or did he leave a bad legacy? As far as his leadership is concerned, that's what we're talking about. And so whether or not he was rated a good king or a bad king, that's what we're looking at. And just for an example, if you look at Amaziah down here, both of these individuals are considered good kings, but if you look at some of the things that they did, you'll find a but. But they didn't do what? They didn't get rid of the statues in the high places. There were some very important buts they didn't do. And so they may have some good qualities, and overall their reign may have led to the people still doing some good things, but there were some pretty lacking things in their personalities. Okay? Now, if you drop on down and we look at Manasseh, how is he rated? We would rate Manasseh not just bad, we would call him an evil king, wouldn't we? He had the longest reign of any of the kings. He reigned for 55 years. He was an evil person. He did terrible things, right? And he was so bad, he was taken into captivity to Babylon. But, isn't that important but again, right? When he was in Babylon, he prayed, and then he was restored to the throne. And we'll find in his later years, he tried to undo some of the evil that he did in his younger years. But he couldn't undo it, could he? So it might be that in his later years, he might be saved. When we go to heaven, we might see him in heaven. He might be saved in the end. But the problem was, and the reason why he's rated an evil king, is the overall thrust of his kingdom was what? Evil. It was bad. It wasn't just bad, it was terribly evil. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get back to our outline. God is going to cite the evil that was done under his leadership as one of the reasons why the kingdom had to come to an end. The reason why Judah would have to go into captivity. We'll see individual Josiah, you talk about somebody that's a high point. He's one of the high points of all the Judah, the kings in Judah. He did everything within his power to tear out the high places, to do that which was good, to show his disdain for those prophets of Baal. He dug up their bones and burnt their ashes upon the altar, right? He showed the people in every possible way that he had disdain for idolatry and that he had love for God. He rebuilt the temple. He started putting the temple back together that had fallen into disrepair. And what was found during his reign? The book of the law. They had lost it. Can you imagine?
What was they going on then? If they didn't have the book of law to know what to do, what they done, traditions?
They were worshiping false gods.
Well, somebody had to tell him the truth, how to worship Jehovah. So it was all verbal, right? We remember a lot. We may not remember it correctly, but we remember a lot. So they had to find the book of the law, and when it was read in public, what did the king do? He tore his clothes because he realized that they were not following the law correctly, right? So in every way, Josiah was a good king. He showed them this is the way that we were supposed to act, what we were supposed to do. So Josiah was one of the highest points of all of that. Now, I also want you to look, if you look down the side, to the right side, how many prophets are during all this time? I may have missed them, but I may have missed one or two. But I was shocked. And there's one or two of them in there that don't have a name. It's just called the man of God. Does that amaze you? Did God ever leave his people without somebody trying to tell them what the truth was?
When they stopped listening, they did.
Did they ever have an excuse? Which brings us to the question, do we have an excuse today? So I leave you to all of that, to read over those, look at the kings, the monarchs, and this will take you all the way down to the captivity and the return from captivity, and some of the great men there of Ezra and Zerubbabel and Zechariah and Nehemiah, and the great work that they did after the return. And but that's after they return from the captivity. So take a look at that as you have time, and that'll help you keep you centered on what is going on there. If you need to know about those kings, but those kings did not do a good job, did they? So when we start our background information, if we go back to our outline, we'll see that Samaria falls to Assyria. All right. If you look in your outlines, the old world empires, you'll see Assyria. Assyria is an empire that's been, or a kingdom that has been in power for over 1,000 years by the time Samaria falls. They've been around a long time. Now, if you look all the way down to the bottom of this and look at the map, you'll see the Hittite Empire on the top side. Assyria has control of the Hittite Empire at this time, but they are a separate people. But Assyria has control of this area here, all the way down into this area here. Assyria is actually named out of the holy city of Ashur. That is their holy city right here. And they control all the way down into Babylonia, all the way down into Ur. We've heard of Ur before, haven't we? We've studied about that several times now. Some important individual came out of Ur, right?
One the Jews all look back to.
Mm-hmm. I think we've heard of him before. Okay, the Assyrians have control of, take control of this area all the way down through Palestine, and from time to time have control even down into Egypt. Now, the Assyrians are a tremendously brutal people. If you study crucifixion, there's some individuals that believe that, some historians that will tell you that crucifixion was developed by the Assyrians. Of course, it was perfected by the Romans, but they said that the Assyrians started it. More often than not, the Assyrians often used impalement as one of their prime ways of executing people, and then they would leave them there for everyone to see. Put people up on spikes, or just put the heads of individuals on spikes. I read several historians that was talking about the fact that they would have banquets, and they'd either have piles of heads, and some of them that were piled quite high, around their banquet tables, or they would put the heads up on spikes and leave them around their banquet tables. Can you imagine?
There's people in Syria still cut people's heads off today.
Cruel, brutal people. And through this type of intimidation and that type of stuff, this is how they controlled their area. You didn't want to rise up against the Assyrian army. They were brutal. And they made it a point of being brutal. So as we go back up here, we see the first king here. He makes them into a fighting machine. They've been around for a long time. They fought back and forth, but this particular king makes them into a fighting force. Might ask you, if you happen to know, what is the capital city for the Assyrians? Anyone else?
Did you say it's Ashur or something like that?
Okay. In point of fact, it was Nineveh, it was Haran, it was Ashur. It depended on the king at the time. He would choose his own capital city. More often than not, it was Nineveh. But and Nineveh was a vast city. You will hear about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. There is evidence that there were vast gardens with pumps and things of that nature in the city of Nineveh. In fact, some historians are now saying that maybe the Hanging Gardens that were talked about was actually in the city of Nineveh and not in Babylon at all. Or perhaps maybe Nebuchadnezzar got the idea for his hanging gardens from the city of Nineveh. I think it's probably more likely. Nonetheless, Nineveh was a beautiful city. It was large, but Haran and other cities, when Nineveh fell, the king at the time went to the city of Haran, and 3 years later it was toppled. Normally most historians feel like the Assyrian Empire fell when Nineveh fell. I've tried to put some of the artwork, some of the pictures of some of the, like Shalmaneser. You'll see his photograph here, or a statue of him here. And then some of the individuals, as they are mentioned in the New Testament, or excuse me, in the Old Testament, like King Ahab, he had to commit troops to this particular Battle of Karkar to Shalmaneser, and that is mentioned on this obelisk. And and when I say committed, I don't know if he was fighting with or fighting against him. I never could figure that one out. So I just said he committed the troops, because that's what is written on the obelisk, is that he got so many troops. Other individuals as they go down here, but as we follow it all the way down, they had trouble with Assyria for a long time. And I don't know if you realize this or not, but if you'll read what I have written down here in these other times, there was at least 3 different times that they were under 3 different kings, that they were deported out of Israel. Under 3 different kings. Ezra talks about it, the Kings talk about it, and the Chronicles talks about it. Under Esarhaddon, under Talgath-Pileser, usually called just Pul, these things, and at Esarhaddon, Assyria was a huge problem for Israel. It was a problem at times for Judah. But they were a strong power, and they caused them a lot of headaches. And most of the headaches they caused was for what reason? God was punishing his people because they didn't trust God to protect them. They trusted in other things. They trusted in other gods. They trusted in other alliances with other things rather than trust the God of heaven. And when they did, they were delivered. But when they didn't, bad things happened to them. But when they offended the God of heaven, when certain certain kings offended the God of heaven, then bad things happened to them, didn't they? 120,000 Syrian soldiers lay dead, right? So we have cataloging of certain things happening, and then he goes back and his 2 sons slay him in his own temple.
It's something we should, it's important to learn from the past, so you don't repeat it. But I mean, the reason those kings went into Israel is they saw weakness. And the weakness was due to their immorality and their king that wasn't very good at leadership. They saw a weak leader and they said, here's an opportunity to go in. Every time they went in, God allowed it to happen for punishment reasons. But the reason it happened was because a strong king said, I've got an opportunity to take these weak people because they're under bad leadership, they're weak morally, they're weak, it's just a good opportunity. And, take heed lest you fall,
And there's some real practical applications of that. We see that today. One of our own presidents said, walk softly and carry a big stick. There's a reason for that. We don't want to stir up problems, but if we have to take care of a problem, we want to take care of it. We want to take care of it soundly. We want to carry ourselves strongly. And God has always acted in such a fashion. We need to be quiet. We need to carry ourselves with quiet dignity. However, that's a good comment. All right, so look over those things. I think you'll find it very interesting. I've tried to log a lot of the interactions between the kings, both in Judah and in Israel, with those kings there. And I think you'll find that there's a lot of heartache there because those kings and the people were not doing what God had told them to do. But eventually Samaria falls, and that's all because God has put them into captivity because they are idolatrous. The term that is used so very often by the prophets at that time, or by God at that time, is that of adultery. You've committed adultery. And that term brings up revulsion in our minds, right? What term is more detestable to us than those individuals that are unfaithful in the marriage? The marriage relationship was designed to be sacred between a husband and wife. And so God uses that relationship to tell his people just how much revulsion he has towards what they have done. He called to them, he begged to them. That's part of the reason why I wanted to show you how many prophets were involved. I think sometimes we think there was just a few. There were many. And that's just the ones we know about. Remember, if you go through that period of time, you will see that there were schools of the prophets. I suggest to you there were many more prophets than what we even know about. Those are just the ones that have been revealed to us. And so God has spoken to his people. He begged with these people. Turn back, turn away from idolatry, turn back to me. Do what you promised to do. Be faithful to me. He was willing to forgive, but they would not. And there came a point where the justice of God had to be appeased. Our God is just. Our God is merciful. Our God is gracious. But there comes a point when his justice has to be appeased. And that should make us fearful. And they thought that, no, God won't do this to us. We're his chosen people. No, those things will never happen to us. And we need to understand the same thing. There comes a point when God's mercy and his grace cannot cover up those things which we do. Now, He's made a way for us, but we have to be obedient to that plan. Otherwise, God's justice takes over. When we stand before Him on the day of judgment, thank you, we won't be asking for justice. We'll be asking for mercy. And He's made a way for that mercy. Have we taken advantage of it? Have we done what He said to do in order to achieve that mercy, to get that mercy? His own people didn't. He offered it and offered it and offered it until it was not available anymore. And we need to be aware of that. This is what we're seeing here, right? Okay, in point 2 here, we see peoples from other regions are transplanted into the area of Samaria. And so you see the New Testament Samaritans. These individuals are transplanted, even though we'll see that they are taught the way of the Jews, the worship of the Jews. Still, they worshiped idols, and so by the time we get to the New Testament Samaritans, you'll see a mixture of a little bit of the Jewish religion and a little bit of something else. And so there's a great hatred between the two peoples. It's not so much that it's a mixed race, as sometimes people talk about. I don't think that's so much as already? It's as so much as they mixed a combination of religion. And the Jews couldn't tolerate that. Nor should we. You can't mix God's religion. You either do what God has told us to do or you don't. Mixing something else with it taints it, destroys it, makes it something that it's not. It don't matter how much you add something else to it. It's no longer now what it was originally. And that's what the Samaritans did. They wanted to do a little bit of it with their own thing. Okay. So we talk about Hezekiah. He was a good king. We talked about Sennacherib. He prays because Sennacherib is threatening him. He offends the God of heaven. Do you remember what he said? Remember what Sennacherib said? Who is that God that can protect you? No God of any of the other countries was able to save them. So who is that God? God of the Jews can't save you. None of the other gods was able to save them. Ooh, that was probably the wrong thing to say, don't you think? Next morning, 185,000 lay dead. And he goes home in shame. And his own sons kill him. Okay, remember he prays also, and God adds 15 years to his life. But he does something very foolish. Remember? What was that he does?
Shows him all the wealth and temples.
Yeah. When emissaries from Babylon come, he shows them all the wealth of the temple. And what is he told? Thy sons shall be eunuchs in the household of the king of Babylon. And when we get to chapter 1, we're going to talk about that. Okay? And I am going to stop there, and we will talk about Manasseh because there is a lot to talk about with Manasseh. I meant to get further than that, but I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your kind attention.